Leopold's Laboratory. 84 years ago, Aldo Leopold wrote the following: "A science of land health needs first of all a base datum of normality, a picture of how healthy land maintains itself as an organism. The most perfect norm is wilderness. Paleontology offers abundant evidence that wilderness maintains itself for immensely long periods, that its component species were rarely lost, neither did they get out of hand, that weather and water built soil as fast or faster than it was carried away. Wilderness, then, assumes unexpected importance as a laboratory for the study of land health." Leopold's land laboratory or natural laboratory concept will be the basic theme of this discussion. Endangered species and their relationship to wilderness will be the major part of the entire paper, but I'll go beyond that to explore ways in which species in wilderness and without may be prevented from becoming threatened or endangered. The original working title of this paper was Wilderness, Endangered Species, Capabilities, and Conflicts. In that framework, I drew on observations from my own work in wilderness and on species dependent on wilderness habitats. Many capabilities as well as conflicts were obvious. As that framework developed, I rediscovered the thoughts and concepts earlier advanced by eminent scholars of wilderness and wildlife. Leopold, Marshall, Murie, Olson, Craighead, Allen, and others. Schoenfeld and Hendis have articulated these same thoughts in their excellent work, Wildlife Management in Wilderness. All of these authors extol the value and virtue of wilderness to our culture. All point out eloquently that wildlife is an integral, important, and essential component of any wilderness ecosystem. Allen, in North American Wildlife Policy, stated one of our highest priorities should be the preservation of species, especially the perpetuation of natural gene pools unchanged by human use. Of particular value are protected areas large enough to support self-contained populations of native carnivores and the plant-eating animals they prey upon. Rare or endangered ecosystems should have highest priority. From the beginning of the wilderness movement, wildlife has been considered of great importance. At the same time, it became obvious that few things have changed with respect to wildlife in wilderness. Since these scholars wrote and spoke, there have been a surge in interest in wilderness. The Wilderness Act and Wilderness Preservation System have come into existence, and a significant enlargement in official wilderness has resulted. Wildlife is always one of the critical factors considered when new areas are set aside. Yet, we have seen little attention paid afterward to associated wildlife within officially designated areas. We have the Endangered Species Act and other legislation aimed at specific groups of species, but these are catch-up or after-the-fact measures. Too often, Haldane's blinding glimpse of the obvious is pointed out to our profession by the public. Moreover, we have seen the list of threatened and endangered species grow steadily. The question naturally looms large. Why hasn't threatened or endangered wildlife seen more attention in wilderness? This discussion, then, will be wide-ranging than the title implies. It will review wilderness and wildlife capabilities with special reference to threatened and endangered species. It will explore some of the conflicts or reasons that seem to me responsible for the lack of more intense and viable wildlife research and management in officially designated wilderness. And finally, it will explore some ways in which wildlife in wilderness, if it is all that important to us, might receive more attention and wilderness be truly utilized as a natural laboratory. Most of my examples will be mammals because of my greater familiar with them. It will be useful to review the capabilities of wilderness as a natural laboratory. Schoenfeld and Hendy list three categories for wildlife in wilderness. 1, wilderness-dependent wildlife. 2, wilderness-associated wildlife, and 3, common wildlife found in wilderness. The following can apply to all 3 categories, but is most important to those species dependent on wilderness. First, wilderness can act as a refuge. Most visible examples are wolves and grizzly bears in national parks and national forest wilderness. These areas provide size and extent of habitat necessary to sustain populations of these big carnivores. Size is important because it insulates the population from competition with man. For some species, the wilderness refuge can function as a reservoir that repopulates surrounding areas. The primitive area, now official wilderness in Idaho, 1.25 million acre officially designated primitive area since 1931, has functioned in such a manner for mountain lions. Similarly, Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Area in Montana have functioned as both refuge and reservoir for wolverines. These areas only can sustain populations of rare species, but also can be utilized for reintroduction of native species. This cannot be accomplished anywhere else with large predators. This should be given more consideration, not just for endangered species, but other species as well. Established wildlife populations in wilderness can provide answers to many questions concerning the preservation and maintenance of wilderness and all its components. Our work on mountain lions showed that lion predation on mule deer and elk was an important factor in maintaining ecological stability in the central Idaho wilderness. Lions removed a certain number of deer and elk each year, lessening the impact on the plant community, but their influence on surviving populations was considered equally important. Relatively unexploited wildlife populations provide the natural gene pools and can provide an insight into intrinsic behavioral mechanisms that can and should form the basis for any management program outside wilderness. They can provide an insight into all these population processes, which we can measure our influence elsewhere. In short, wilderness populations can provide the baseline data, an understanding of which is essential if we are to prevent the list of endangered species from becoming even longer. Unable to adapt to increasing human numbers and shrinking habitats outside non-official wilderness will surely be added to that list unless we gain more knowledge now. So the opportunity for research certainly present in our wilderness system. Schoenfeld and Henley lament the lack of information and cite the need for research. They state, fish and wildlife research in general is underfunded, particularly those deep digging basic studies that must undergird all applied research. We need more basic research on total natural ecosystems, research that looks comprehensively at all their plant-animal relationships. This basic research need not and should not be restricted to endangered species. It should be undertaken on numerous game and non-game species which we know little. The relatively rare, naturally low density species should perhaps receive high priority, such as fisher, wolverine, river otter, lynx. These gray area species could conceivably become endangered in a short time. This is especially true when a species is economically valuable, as are some fur bearers. But some of our more common wildlife should all be researched in wilderness. Murray's work on coyotes in Yellowstone nearly 85 years ago was the closest we've come to understanding an unexploited natural population of this species and the intrinsic mechanisms that may operate in such a population. That work has not been extended anywhere, yet during the last 40 years we've spent millions of dollars trying to control the numbers of this animal. There are numerous other examples. Formerly, such long-term basic research was funded by universities or by federal granting organizations such as the National Science Foundation. For a number of years, however, this trend has been away from such support. Scientists find themselves forced into spending more time raising funds than performing in their field. Further, single species research, even though it is ecosystem-oriented, is not likely to be considered for funding despite the dearth of basic biological and economical information that exists on many species. Finally, in our review of opportunities present in the Wilderness Laboratory, the opportunity exists to describe and delineate critical habitat for a particular species before it becomes endangered. It seems logical this should be high priority in any research. All such research should and could conform to the philosophy that wilderness values are first and foremost. The position taken by the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies could act as a research guideline. We've explored possibilities that most scientists agree are desirable in wilderness interactions. When we ask if these wildlife programs have been or are being pursued or carried out, we must answer no. The University of Idaho is the first and currently the only institution to establish a wholly dedicated program for the study of pristine wilderness ecosystems. A field station located in the heart of the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness serves both the university's research and education mission year-round. But there are but a handful of research projects on wildlife currently underway in the mountainous wilderness in both Idaho and Montana. Most of these are underfunded, short-term efforts, most often supported by outside independent organizations. These huge areas with their wealth of diverse wildlife could be likened to a modern, multi-million-dollar, unused chemistry laboratory. Let's examine the reasons why. First, the language of the 1964 Wilderness Act does not assign high priority to wildlife. In fact, wildlife is directly mentioned only once in the Act, and that is in reference to states' responsibility for wildlife and fish. Effective management of any resource depends on clear management objectives. Such objectives for all aspects of wilderness, including fish and wildlife, must be spelled out clearly. But the Wilderness Act does not spell out those objectives for implementation. This absence of guidelines for the different agencies results in different approaches to the treatment of wildlife in officially designated wilderness. The Forest Service manages most of official wilderness, but the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service also administer wilderness. Each of these agencies has its legal responsibilities. Each is subject to economic and political constraints and realities, and each is steeped in a different, strong, traditional philosophy. There it is not surprising, in the absence of a clear mandate concerning wildlife, that different paths are followed. In many cases, this means little or no attention to wildlife, the attitude simply being take care of wilderness and wildlife will take care of itself. For example, the Forest Service budgets only a small percentage of its entire budget for wildlife management on any of its lands, not just wilderness. Secondly, state agencies have jurisdiction over resident wildlife, and this further complicates the pictures. State agencies are subject to the same realities, same pressures and constraints, legal, political, fiscal, traditional, as are the federal agencies. Often these factors are locally intense. The wolf and grizzly serve as good examples. For the above reasons, often there is little federal-state cooperation. The statesmanlike dialogue among federal and state agency and other groups, referred to by Schoenfeld and Hendy, has seldom come about. Only after legislation such as the Endangered Species Act or the formation of executive authorities such as the Endangered Species Scientific Authority do the agencies turn to statesmanlike dialogue. My point is that these legal, political, and fiscal realities and constraints, plus strong tradition, prevent both federal and state agencies from exercising foresight with respect to wildlife. Because of these realities, they must set priorities for the present and only the very near future. They cannot assign sizable resources to some future endeavor or to the little understood or appreciated basic research. Therefore, no agency is able or as yet willing to support the kind of long-term, deep-digging basic research that is so sorely needed. Agencies do necessarily give more attention to political and economic considerations as well as adhere to traditional goals. They do a very credible job of tending shop. For very realistic reasons, agencies exercise foresight, but can and do very active positively after the crisis is declared. Recovery plans are announced with sizable funding, recovery teams are formed, transplants are considered, captive breeding is begun or at least considered, foster parent programs are discussed, habitat protection initiated, on and on. How much easier it would seem if we could exercise foresight and attempt to prevent endangered status. So what's the answer? First, all these agencies and groups must recognize wildlife as an intricate, important, and essential component of wilderness. There must be closer cooperation and more communication between traditionally provincial and sometimes defensive state agencies and a too often all-knowing federal agency. What is required is a framework which recognizes the need for long-term, deep-digging basic research and provide the funding to carry it out. The program needs to be independent of agencies in order to free the research and researchers from political realities and the built-in priorities with which these agencies must live. This would also provide the maximum use of funds on the actual research itself with a minimum on administration and overhead. The program could be designed to recognize foresight in our profession and reward this foresight with adequate research funding. Rewarding foresight would hopefully slow the growing box store of threatened and endangered species by providing biological and ecological information before species numbers reach a critical point. I'd like to suggest a possible way of achieving such a program. It involves an amendment to the Wilderness Act, an amendment that recognized the importance of wildlife to the integrity of wilderness ecosystems. The amendment would provide funding for utilizing wilderness as the natural laboratory it was intended to be. These funds, appropriated by Congress, could be administered independently by the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture. An advisory board of wilderness and wildlife professionals appointed by the two secretaries could review needs for research and advise the secretaries on research priorities. The board could also award independent grants to carry out the program's objectives. Moreover, such an advisory board, by interacting with wilderness and wildlife professionals and with the agencies with primary responsibility for wilderness, could enhance implementation of research findings. The suggested program would not in any way affect existing research and management funding or the carrying out of any existing federal or state program, nor does it fault the need for short-term problem-solving research. This is needed and always will be. Finally, the program should recognize that official wilderness philosophy must be foremost in any project undertaken. All state and federal agencies would be consulted before any project was initiated. Our profession is blessed with numerous examples of glorious hindsight. As the human population grows, as wilderness outside official designated wilderness diminishes, we should certainly be blessed with more examples. Less adaptable species of wildlife will be added to the box score and totaled up on the endangered list. Our responsibility as a profession does not lie in simply caretaking or attempting to husband remnant species, but in preventing species from becoming endangered, if that is possible. Leopold's Wilderness Laboratories offer beautiful opportunities to accomplish this but we must provide the framework in which it can be done. Thank you.